happens in each of our individual lives? Now, that's not a new question. It's been asked for centuries by those who wonder about the connection between God and humankind. Does the God who takes care of the big picture of the universe, does that God, who, let's face it, has a lot to think about and a lot to keep track of, does the God who has a lot of decisions to make every day, the God who separated the light from the dark and the land from the water, does that God really have any time or any interest in what happens in each of our teeny tiny little lives? Well, members in a different congregation and I debated that question for a number of years. Now, this particular group had no problem believing in a divine being. After all, in their thinking, creation came from somewhere. But they had serious doubts about a God who actually had the time and the interest in the details of each of our lives. That kind of God was beyond their comprehension. They couldn't believe that a God who has the big picture in mind actually could care about each one of us, could listen to each of our prayers and actually respond. So my part in the discussion included sharing times when I was certain that God was at work in my life, times when I was certain that God has been at work in human history. I showed them times in the Bible when God was intervening in human history. Well, these members wanted to believe, but it was going to take stories from people other than their pastor. After all, as they reminded me repeatedly, pastors are paid to believe in that stuff. These members had never experienced that feeling, and as a result, they had no evidence of God being involved in human history. But they wanted to believe. Well, I suspect we could say the same thing about Jacob, who at this point in his life probably had his own doubts about a God that cared about his life. Jacob was on the run. Jacob was the twin brother of Esau. And while Esau was the firstborn, Jacob was the twin and born second. As firstborn son, Esau was going to inherit 2/3 of everything. The land, the wealth. He would become the leader and the patriarch of the tribe once his father Isaac died. Jacob, as number 2, was going to receive a whole lot less property. It would be divided between him and any other children his father had. He was going to receive a whole lot less property and wealth, and not only that, Jacob would always have to obey his older brother Esau. Being number 2, being subservient to his older brother, well, that bruised his ego more than a little bit. Esau was the older brother by a matter of moments, and Jacob wanted to be firstborn, so he and his mother Rebekah tricked Esau and Isaac, his father and her husband, into giving Jacob the blessing and the birthright that rightfully belonged to Esau. When Esau figured it out, he was enraged, and he prepared his bow and his quiver of arrows to kill Jacob. Now, by this time, Jacob had figured out he had crossed a line, so with his mother's help, Jacob prepared to run for refuge with his uncle Laban, his mother's brother, who lived up in the land of Haran, the same place that Abraham and Sarah came from originally. Now, Jacob knew Esau was a great hunter and that Esau could track him easily. He also knew that Esau was very good with a bow and arrow. And he really didn't want to die that way, so he ran. He grabbed some provisions and he took off running, and he ran until sunset. Jacob was tired and lonely and scared, so he found the most remote place he could. And in that dark, lonely spot in the wilderness, Jacob lay down to sleep. Now, maybe it was the rock that Jacob used as a pillow. Maybe it was the events of the past few days, but whatever caused it, Jacob had quite the dream that night. Angels, God's messengers, were going up and down a ramp that connected heaven to earth. And while he watched that happening, God appeared at the side of the ramp and talked to Jacob directly. God said, "Jacob, I am the God of your grandfather Abraham and your father Isaac. The land upon which you are sleeping is now your land, and your descendants will be many, and they will cover all of the earth. and your people will be a blessing to all other people. Now, even as he slept, Jacob knew he'd heard those words before. They were the words of the covenant that God had made with his father and his grandfather. But God didn't stop there. God added to the covenant. God said, I will watch over you wherever you go, and one day you'll be able to return home to this land. And in that small addition, God spoke volumes. God spoke Jacob and all of us who followed after Jacob in that faith, that God would always be present with us. That God would never leave us alone, and not only that, God would always bring us home. Well, when Jacob woke up that next morning, he knew he had experienced God's presence. So he followed the custom of that time and took the rock he was sleeping on, laid that as the base, and took other rocks and built a column. And over that column of rocks, he poured olive oil. Those stacks of rocks in that time were called L's. Capital E-L, because El was a word for God. And he called this one Beth-El. We also heard in the centering music that Tracy played El Shaddai, God of the mountain. There were stacks of rocks all over Israel, indicating places where people had experienced God, experienced El. And they would call it El, whatever the name of the place was. Which brings us to the alternative sermon title. Remember those members who doubted God's ability to be involved in their lives? Well, I told them about the stacks of rocks, and one by one after that, on Sunday mornings, they would come up to me one by one for, I think, like 5 Sundays in a row, and one by one they'd say, so where the L is God? You could just hear my mother rolling over in her grave, can't you? Yeah. Well, Jacob knew. The dreams had told him that the ramp between heaven and earth means God's messengers are going up and down, meant that God is very involved in human lives and human history. And God was willing to talk to a very flawed human being, Jacob, which is good news for a lot of us. It means that God is willing to be involved in our lives, no matter how good or how flawed they might be. And God let Jacob and us know that wherever God went, wherever they went or wherever we go, God would be there. And that God would be part of every human life after that. Now, many of us are here today because we've experienced God's presence. We've experienced God's guidance. We have experienced God communicating with us, and we trust God's promises. A lot of us are here because we know and believe God's involved in our lives and in human history. And even though we may know that, we know a whole lot of people in our families, in our circle of friendships, in our workplaces, people in our lives who don't really believe that kind of an experience with God is possible. In fact, in some of their lives, God just does not even exist. For those who think there might be a divine being, yes, God takes care of the big picture, but has absolutely no time for individuals. God takes care of the universe, and even the best and most faithful of us are willing to admit that Earth is just one tiny rock in that huge universe. In other words, we all know people who believe God, if they even are willing to admit there is a God, who says that God has no time for us. And the question then becomes, how do we as people of faith help others experience the God we know? The God who cares about us, the God who is involved in our lives, the God who intervenes in human history. How do we share our experience of God in ways that invite others to be open to a similar experience? How do we share our confidence that God will be present with us now in this world and even when we leave this world? Well, we begin by sharing the stories of those times we have experienced God's presence with us. Whether it's something we see in nature, a sunset, a thunderstorm, Lake Michigan, a bird, a flower, a child, whatever, when we feel that's something we experience, then we have to learn how to tell that story to others. Talking to others about God. Well, let's face it, most of us are uncomfortable with that. Well, too bad, because as you heard before, people figured out that pastors As one church member in another congregation said, professional Christians, they figured out that pastors are supposed to believe that stuff. So our credibility is not very high in their eyes. So when I say we, I really mean you. Because if others are going to believe, it's going to be because somebody other than Christian pastors tell them the story of God's presence in their lives. Somebody other than those who work in the church professionally are going to have to share the story of their experience, of your experience, of God's presence that gives you the confidence to know that God is there for you. God walks with you. And the confidence that God will keep promises and bring us all home one day. But it takes practice. First, we have to know what our story is. How many here know what your story is? Not many. Which means the rest of you, I'm not even going to say we anymore, the rest of you have got to get busy. And look in your lives, and it's usually backwards, look back in our lives, your lives, to figure out that time or those times when we knew without a doubt that God was present. That we felt a peace that passes understanding. We felt hope in a situation that was hopeless. We found courage when we should not have had courage. We could persevere when perseverance seemed foolish. That we could be there and know that God was walking with us. Once we identify those stories, we have to practice telling them. Because the opportunity will come to share that story. Someone will be talking about the fact that God doesn't care about them. And that happens, doesn't it? We know it does. And that's our opportunity to take our well-rehearsed story and share it with that person. Now here's the deal about the well-rehearsed story. It can't be more than a minute long. 1 minute, because people who don't believe any of this stuff will listen for up to a minute. And after that, their eyes will glaze over, or even worse, start to roll. So we have to be able to tell our story convincingly, efficiently, and from the heart. Excuse me. Because it is the stories from the heart that touch other people. It is the stories from the heart, told in less than 1 minute, that people will ponder over. It is those stories from the heart that change lives. Because they changed ours, they can change someone else's. Now Jacob practiced telling his experience of God's presence in his life. And God's presence in his life changed his life and all of human history. And his story was told so often it made it into the book of Genesis in the Bible. And his story continues to change lives. Our experiences and our stories, well, I'm pretty sure mine won't last beyond the minute it takes to tell it. But in that 1 minute, God's Spirit will help our stories make a difference. In that 1 minute, God's Spirit will go to work on somebody else and help them open their heart to God's presence in their lives. We can tell those stories because we know that God cares about each one of us. We've felt it. We know it. And we know that God is involved in human history. My way of knowing that is there's still a world around today. There's still a world around today. So many times since the nuclear age, we've come to the brink of destroying ourselves, and we have not. Why? Not because we're so good, but I believe because God has intervened. And we know that God has given each of us a story to share. And you all have to share those stories. Because Nancy and I know clergy, well, our credibility with those outside the church, pretty low. So you have to be ready to tell your story. Because your story will change someone's life. Amen. We have the opportunity now to think about that story in our lives, probably more than one, about how our time has been used by God. We have the time now to think about how we will share our story, the ability we have. and we have the opportunity to share our money so that those beyond our walls can hear God's love for them through the programs and ministries of this congregation. Ushers, please wait upon us.